Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, welcome to the final day of Khazanah's Megatrends Forum 2021, entitled The Invention of Tomorrow, Crafting Our New Collective Narrative. If you watched Tamim Ansari's session on day one, The Global Human Self, his closing remarks are that COVID-19, climate change, and technology from the view of human replacement has brought about societal angst, and we need a shared collective to bring us together. Unfortunately, technological advancement and disruption is here to stay, and understanding and embracing it will be crucial in the shared collective discussion. As you would all have experienced, technological advancement and disruption is global and has no borders. Think Amazon, Spotify, and TikTok spawned in different parts of the world, and so has its development and innovation, which brings us to the topic of this session, innovation without borders. If you had asked someone in 2019 what the future might look like, versus asking the same person in 2021, you would very likely get very different responses, notwithstanding the tragedy that the COVID-19 pandemic has wrought upon us all. Taking a more optimistic and hopeful stance, it has also irreversibly altered the lens through which we see our future, bringing with it new pathways and possibilities that were otherwise closed, or at the very least, very unlikely before. But what are these possible pathways in our future? Crafting our new collective narrative requires an understanding of global megatrends and the various ways in which future technologies may come to bear in our daily lives. Join us in a session that looks to the future, exploring the megatrends facing the world and how technologies such as cybersecurity, genetic research, and drone technology will impact us all. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of this session, Shawn Henry. Shawn is Chief Security Officer at CrowdStrike and President of CrowdStrike Services, a leading world-class team of cybersecurity professionals engaged in response operations across every major commercial sector, protecting organizations' sensitive data and networks globally. Shawn spent 24 years at FBI, becoming Executive Assistant Director, overseeing all cyber investigations worldwide. He led the establishment of the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, forging partnerships domestically and internationally within governments and the private sector. His recognitions include, amongst others, President Award for Meritorious Executive, one of the most influential people in the Information Security magazine, NSC magazine, Federal 100 Award, and McAfee's Inc.'s Cybercrime Fighter of the Year. Shawn has lectured at various prestigious universities, has held and currently holds many high-profile directorships, has been a keynote speaker at many major conferences, was a U.S. delegate to the G8, and has been interviewed by or contributed extensively to countless television, radio, and newspapers segments. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Shawn to kick off the session.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate that very warm welcome and the opportunity to be here talking to this esteemed group. Malaysia has really become a leader in cybersecurity, and I think that Malaysia's standing really comes from an early commitment to cybersecurity issues and a strong national strategy. I think that there's a lot can be learned by people around the world with some of the things happening in Kuala Lumpur. This is such an important issue for me. I think when I look at the incredible speakers we have on this panel, the industries that they're in, the innovation that they're contributing to, the need for cybersecurity is fundamental to the success of those organizations, to their technological development and their sustainability. So I think this is just such an important place for us to be. I'd like to talk about some of the emerging threats that we're seeing around the world, what the cybersecurity environment currently looks like, and I want to explain it in a special way. It's not going to be very technical, but I want people to be thinking about this in a creative way. First, I think it's important when we're talking about cybersecurity, there's one key word that comes into play for executives when you're evaluating cybersecurity, and that's risk. What is the exposure to danger that your organization or your network has? And when I think about risk as it relates to cybersecurity, this is a business risk. It's no different than any other type of evaluation you're doing in your organization, whether it be expansion into a new geographic area, the beginning of a new business line, a merger or an acquisition of your company with somebody else. Those are business risks. The security of the environment is a business risk. As I evaluate the risk of the network, I think about three components to that: threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. And I think if we think about cybersecurity risk this way, it's really helpful to understand first the threat component, who the threat adversaries are. I won't go into great detail because you've likely heard of these different groups, but I think it's important to understand their capabilities. What we're seeing are these adversary groups that are changing their tactics on a regular basis, very similar to how we've seen COVID virus changing in response to vaccines. As we create new capabilities in cybersecurity, the adversaries are changing their attack patterns, and that's very difficult. Nation states being the most capable actors that we see. There are dozens of nations around the world who have cybersecurity programs in place to exfiltrate data, to collect intelligence, in many cases to steal intellectual property of companies around the world that they can then funnel to their home corporations. And these nation states are really, in many cases, wreaking havoc on the cybersecurity landscape within organizations globally. Another group that we're seeing quite extensively are hacktivist groups that are motivated by political or social information. They're looking to make a political statement or to get their name out. We've seen actually government organizations in Malaysia targeted by a group called Anonymous because of the perception that there wasn't enough cybersecurity in Malaysia, and Anonymous targeted the Malaysian government. But we see activists targeting not only governments, but individual corporations around the globe because they're not happy with some of the stances those organizations are making. Certainly organized crime groups, which we've seen more prolifically in the last couple of years, specifically as it relates to ransomware. I'll talk about ransomware in some more specificity, but these e-crime or organized crime groups are quite sophisticated. They've got great capabilities. They are primarily motivated for financial gain. These organizations are making millions and millions of US dollars on an annual basis, in many cases on individual attacks themselves. We've also seen terrorist groups that have started to use the internet and distribution of malware for their personal gain, for them to launch attacks similar to what they've done in the physical world, targeting organizations or societies because of their interest in getting their political statements heard. And of course, the insider, individuals that are working inside organizations who have turned oftentimes to target the very company they're working for, the government agency that they're working for. And we've seen many examples of this over the years. But it could be somebody who's just an employee who becomes disgruntled, somebody who is not happy with the way the company is moving. They might start as a whistleblower where they want to spread information about what's happening in the company, but we've also seen them use technical capabilities to exfiltrate or even to sabotage the networks. So these are threats that create a problem within the enterprise. All of these tactics are ever evolving, and as defenders, it's really important to make sure that we're trying to keep pace with them. We've seen these adversary groups in many cases become much more arrogant. There used to be a very specific effort to remain covert, to operate under the radar. But recently we've seen different groups, including these organized crime groups, that are not very careful about protecting their identity. In many cases, they seem not to care. They're using different types of techniques that allow them to be identified, and their operational security has become much less of a factor. And all of these groups are seeing a very large return on their very small investment because of the ability for them from a financial perspective or from a theft of identification or intelligence perspective. They're seeing a substantial gain there. The second part of this is the vulnerabilities piece. And really, I call this the expansion of the network. As the target space continues to get larger, there are more and more vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And we've seen all of these different adversary groups, again, taking very interesting and different perspectives on getting access into the environment. We're looking at things like IoT, the Internet of Things, where there are billions and billions of devices that have been introduced to the networks in the past few years, many of which have little security built in, and they're built for functionality. When I think about the auto industry or healthcare sector or home goods, home manufacturing, things like refrigerators and dishwashers that are being added to the network with internet capability, with functionality of computers. They're computerized, they've got processors, they can be exploited, and they're creating an access into the broader network many times. And this is a huge concern for organizations as we continue to go forward. One of the other areas that we're seeing exploited much more regularly is the operational technology within the environment. So in many organizations, we have information technology, which is the back end administration, where legal department and HR and the functionality of the day-to-day business is kept, a lot of the financial data, et cetera. And the operational technology piece, the manufacturing part, the computers that are driving the equipment that are manufacturing goods, that are creating cars, processing food, making pharmaceuticals. We see oftentimes the gap between the IT and the OT that is being exploited by adversaries. So what does that mean? In many cases, there's a physical gap between these two pieces of technology, but the adversaries are exploiting the fact that there's not a lot of cooperation or coordination between the two groups that are administering the networks, and oftentimes where there's not supposed to be a logical connection, there is, and that's inadvertent in many cases. In other cases, it's designed into the architecture, but it's important to understand that when those devices are targeted, they have a significant impact on organizations. We're seeing the physical security of information security being exploited. So what does that mean? When you think about cybersecurity, of course, you think about the digital network, but all of these networks require human beings to administer them, human beings that are using them. And oftentimes we've seen adversaries target the human beings that are behind the networks. So we've seen companies, for example, that have hired people into their environment who are actually working for an organized crime group or for a foreign intelligence service. And they've intentionally gained employment so that they have close access to the environment, to the network. We've also seen these groups that have targeted individual employees inside companies, offering them money to exploit the network. In some cases, we've seen them threatened, where they've been targeted and family members have been threatened unless the employee working in the company is willing to help access the network. There was just a recent case within the last year where Tesla had an employee that was targeted and offered $1 million in order to introduce a USB device into the environment containing malware, purportedly to gain access for that particular group operating out of Russia to target Tesla and their environment. So this merging of the physical space and the digital space needs to absolutely be a concern for individuals that are responsible for cybersecurity in the environment. And then the last vulnerability I'll talk about is the threats to the supply chain. You may have heard recently in the last 6 months or so about SolarWinds, an organization, a company that produces network security software that was targeted, and an adversary got into the environment where the software was being built, and they introduced malicious code into the software. And when that software was subsequently downloaded by thousands of organizations around the world, they actually allowed the adversaries access into the environment. Really important to understand that every organization that you're doing business with is connected to your environment. So it's your partners, or in many cases, customers who have access to your environment, subcontractors you're doing business with, all of whom pose a potential security threat to your environment and can create access. And this concept of the build environment, where software or hardware is being targeted before it comes into the environment, as well as the organizations you're doing business with, those concepts are really, really critically important to cybersecurity and the organizations that you're leading. So we're seeing a lot there. The last part of this risk calculus I want you to consider is the impact piece. I've talked about the threat actors. There's a human being behind every attack. I've talked about the vulnerabilities that are routinely being exploited, and that's continuing. But the most important part, I think, and when we look at the risk calculus, is this concept of impact. And the most recent or most prolific is ransomware. It's something you've seen and heard in the media recently. I can tell you that it is on the significant upswing. Adversaries used to purely exfiltrate data, usernames and passwords, credit card numbers, personally identifiable information over the last 20 years. But this movement to these disruptive attacks like ransomware have changed the risk calculus. So it's incredibly prevalent. We've seen in more than 80% of the investigations that we've been involved in, there is a ransomware component to disrupt the business. And that has caused companies to be out of business for weeks, or in some cases months, because their data has been encrypted. They don't have access to their data. Their operations have been disrupted. They can't sell their products. They can't communicate with employees. They don't have access sometimes to parts of their organization because the digital interface has been disrupted. And this is an incredible concern for companies because of the risk that it poses. Companies are paying in excess of $1 million US to pay for the decryption keys, which in many cases is the only way for them to get access to their network. But we've seen companies that have paid more than $30 million US. So a significant concern. When I think about the near future, what do we have coming in the next couple of years? One thing that I think needs to be a concern for everybody is destructiveware. So I've talked about disruptive ransomware, where your data is encrypted and your software is targeted, but we've seen attacks where the physical hardware has been destroyed because of a digital attack. So the boot sector on computers, on servers, laptops, and desktops has been overwritten. So the computer can't boot up. It's rendered inoperable. So the remedy is not just reloading the data as in a ransomware attack, but it's actually bringing in brand new hardware to ensure that the network is rebuilt. And that can take months or more. We've seen companies that have been down for many, many months because of these destructive attacks. 3 nation states have launched destructive attacks against hundreds of companies around the world. This is a global issue, and it's something that we should be concerned about, and how our governments might be able to have discussions to help companies understand, and how to get governments to better abide by the common rules where this is not allowed to occur. I also think we're going to see a lot more of misinformation campaigns. We've certainly seen this globally in election cycles, where there's been misinformation, where data is changed, where data is manipulated, where data is leaked or completely manufactured, and it's created quite a problem. Certainly in the U.S., we've seen it quite extensively, but it is a global issue, and we've seen it throughout Europe and Asia as well. A couple of things to consider here as I wrap up. As leaders, I think it's really important to help come up with a solution to these problems I've just described. One of the most important is about training and education. People need to understand what the risks are so they can apply the appropriate resources. That might include doing attack simulations, tabletop exercises, so people can train and understand what the issues are, and they will know how to respond when there is a crisis. I think it's also important to recognize that companies need to be proactive. They need to hunt on their network, looking for indicators of an attack. For years, we have focused on defense in depth, where we put the appropriate layers in place, passwords, multi-factor authentication, firewalls, etc. But it's critically important that we hunt proactively on the network 24/7, looking for indicators that an adversary is there, and that's important to use the right technology. I think it's also important to have a continuity of operations plan in place. So if you do face one of these attacks, you're able to quickly reconstitute your environment. And it's important to remember you can't have static security in a dynamic environment. The adversary is dynamic. We need to be too. Risk is high. We have to do what we can to mitigate, because the consequences are critical, and that requires leadership. So I ask all of you to stand strong and follow this, lead your organizations, and take this very seriously. I want to thank you all for listening and appreciate your time. Good luck for the rest of the conference.